I next want to ask Ken Cornew to come on up. Ken is the CEO and president of Exelon Generation, and he's going to join, and he and I will have a conversation here about what Exelon is doing and what that means for how corporations are beginning to think about climate change. He's responsible for overseeing 32,000 megawatts of Exelon generation, including the nation's largest nuclear generation fleet, and a very strong and growing renewable business. Both of those are carbon-free, I want to point out. It's very important. He's also Exelon's chief commercial officer and an executive vice president in the full company. Prior to his current role, he was CEO of Constellation in Baltimore, which is a place I lived in for 28 years, and worked with the precursors to Constellation back in the day, as they say, when we were working on things like the Chesapeake Bay and reducing nitrogen deposition and all of that. And we can all say the word selective catalytic reduction now, can't we? That predates the carbon issues, but. So I'm happy to spend some time with Ken here, and let's. I forgot to be mic'd up.
Now you got to hold it.
Oh my goodness.
Well, thank you for the introduction. I just want to say I'm glad to be in the second most crowded room in Washington right now. I feel like it's a much better place than maybe the first most crowded room is. I will also say apologize for Chris Crane not being here. Congressman Upton mentioned Chris. Obviously, our CEO and a really staunch leader in this area. He couldn't make it, asked me to step in, so I'm honored to be here, like I said. And I also would like to say, Bob, congratulations on this rollout. This is really, really meaningful work that's being done. It's really hard to wrap your hands around this problem. Decarbonization of an economy, and we'll get into it, I'm sure, is a huge and complicated challenge, right? And to have a roadmap and an agenda and call on the kind of leadership that's needed to get this going in the next 10 years is really, really vital, really vital. So thank you very much for doing this. All the hard work with all the companies that you worked with is, I think, paid off. I did get a couple days with the report, not one night, and so I got to read kind of half of it or skim through it a little bit. So he knows all about the report. He's done a great job. Thank you.
Well, thank you for saying that. You know, the interesting part of the trying to deal with decarbonizing an economy as opposed to decarbonizing the power sector or what to do about surface transportation is that there's no one single thing. And so on one side, you have some people who say, you know, if we just did this, we could do it.
Right.
On the other side, there's so many problems, we'll never figure it out, and therefore it'll be too disruptive, and, you know, the underlying theme is, well, maybe we shouldn't do anything. And so, but in between is the reality that there are many things we can do, and aggregately they can build up what we need. But we need to look at the diversity of the economy. The economy is very diverse, and the sectors are very diverse. So I think, as has already been pointed out, and your presence here and many of the folks that we worked with on this report, and I do want to be clear that the report is a C2ES report, you know, and it's our opinions based on those conversations. The companies that we're identifying and talking about have participated and given us advice, but I can't and I don't want to lead anybody to believe that every company agrees with everything in that report. So I think that's an important distinction. But we couldn't have done it without that ground truthing and that input. But, you know, as we've already pointed out, we are seeing clearer signs all the time that businesses are taking greater responsibility for climate solutions, even in the face of, you know, different states doing different things. The federal government, perhaps in a seesaw approach. You know, I participated in the last administration, and we were pushing over here, and this administration is pushing over here. You guys, you have to keep going. You have to. You know, what is our business plan? So what is driving this increased attention while the the pendulum swings back and forth. How do you hold a steady keel on this?
So there have been a lot of drivers. You mentioned some over time. Obviously, a company's core values are always a driver here. And for Exelon, our core value has been clean, greenhouse gas emission focused, and that's been for a long time. We could talk about that more. Obviously, the science and the evolution of the science and understanding the science have been drivers. And Exelon clearly agrees with Congressman Upton that there's a challenge here. Climate change is real, and it's a big challenge. But what's different now and in the last couple of years than how we've dealt with it in more of the policy space over time is that customers are driving this agenda now, and they're driving it directly with companies. We did a survey of our 12 million customers. We have a lot of customers, 12 million customers around between the Midwest and the Mid-Atlantic, and as well 48 states across the country with our Constellation business. And overwhelmingly, 93% of those customers said, we acknowledge that climate change is a real problem, and it's there, and they're not fighting that element. 60% of them said, we need to do something now, and you as our energy provider need to take action, and the action needs to be immediate. So when you think about that in context, how does a company inform its own strategy when your customers are saying the products and services that you deliver need to come along with solutions to this challenge? That for Exelon, that's the imperative. And it's been the imperative, and we could talk about that more in a little while. But when you think about our customers as well, I mentioned Constellation. Constellation serves 2/3 of the Fortune 100 companies. So, I'll name a couple, but we serve companies like Google and Starbucks and Comcast Spectacor, big companies that are also getting this same pressure. These companies are getting this pressure from their customers saying, what are you doing? And they have their social values embedded in their culture. So as we evolve in our product offerings and services for energy to these customers through Constellation in a competitive environment, they are moving to want 100% clean, a lot of them, 100% clean energy. There's several companies that have moved in that direction and have that goal. Also, what's interesting is they don't just want to buy renewable energy credits. They don't want to, this credit on a certificate that says, well, this came from somewhere, and hopefully I effectuated change by paying for this renewable energy credit. That's all well and good, and some of that's reality for what you procure when you procure a lot of energy as a customer. But they also want to effectuate change by saying, I'm willing to invest in that renewable plant, whether it's a solar plant or a wind facility. I'm willing to invest, and I kind of want to be hardwired to that plant. So, I want it to be ours, our company. So we found, I think Bloomberg reported that clean energy altogether, industry and government bought almost 14 million megawatt hours of clean energy last year, double what they bought in 2017. I would expect that number will grow substantially in 2019. From a Constellation perspective, we're seeing that we're able to bring this product that says we will build essentially a large solar facility from a larger community perspective or wind facility, and we'll find 6 or 7 of those kinds of customers that want to be a part of that facility. Sounds very complicated when you're negotiating with all those counterparties, but we're making it happen. And that's how business is changing. It's really about what the customers are saying as opposed to just whether you want to move toward the science, move toward the policy objectives. And I think a lot of companies are feeling that right now.
So that's a good summary of the drivers. A lot of people also bring up broader investors and the financial markets and how.
Oh yeah, well, and then you have the investment community that larger funds want to know what your sustainability statements are. Larger funds want to invest in clean tech, and they want to know how you're reducing your carbon footprint, your greenhouse gas emissions, and what you're doing to invest. And you're seeing those disclosures happen more and more. I know your report talks about disclosures and the evolution of disclosures. Some of that gets complicated depending on what it is, especially on the risk side. But that is definitely another trend from the investment community. And why is the investment community doing that? Because the people, again, the customers, the people coming in behind, they're the ones that believe it, and they're the ones that want this to happen.
So it's interesting. This is just a Bob observation here, but you know, you've got businesses becoming sensitive to what customers are interested in, and we're slowly starting to see Congress becoming interested in what the voters are interested in, which seem to be the same people. So that's an evolution. It's on a lag curve, apparently, but I think it's something to keep in mind, that the fact that major corporations in the United States are already in that position. So, you know, your role in Exelon is really looking across all of those units at the generation capacity, which is at the centroid of how you transform, you know, over time. How are these drivers affecting, you know, the work you guys do on your longer term planning, or, you know, the integrated resource plans and things of that nature? How is that starting to translate into your actual, you know, utility planning for like 10 years out, 15 years out?
And I'm glad you said utility, because yeah, I'm at the center of the competitive piece of the business, but we have a very, very large utility base of 6 utilities, mostly in the Mid-Atlantic, and then in Chicago, covering big cities. So this is it's a big deal for us from a utility perspective too, and we can talk more about that. But this is nothing new for Exelon. When Exelon was formed in 2000, it was the combination of Commonwealth Edison Company and PECO, the Philadelphia company. We both owned large segments of nuclear power. Commonwealth Edison had divested a significant amount of its non-nuclear generation, its fossil generation, and we immediately brought those companies together, and from my business's perspective, talked about how we are going to align our generation with a customer-facing business, and how we're going to continue to effectuate greenhouse gas reductions with our large nuclear fleet and growing, slowly at the time, growing renewable fleet. And so we decided to divest over 6,300 megawatts, or retire over 6,300 megawatts of coal-fired generation. We evolved over time and continued to build this business in that context. We had 3 different greenhouse gas reduction initiatives for ourselves internally, and we've achieved all of those, and they were very aggressive. In 2012, we merged with Constellation, and Constellation, again, another footprint of nuclear plants, a large retail marketing presence, which was very meaningful to having all this energy to have to market. We merged with that entity, again, divested coal generation, and now we have no coal generation in our fleet. We are 90% clean energy. What we produce, 90% of it is clean, including our nuclear renewable business. Every 1 out of 9 megawatt hours that's produced in the United States is produced by Exelon. So that's a really meaningful number for me. And I would also say Exelon's carbon emissions are 5 times lower than any other large generator in the United States. So this was a deliberate strategy for us. It was, you know, kind of par for the course from the start for us that this would be our driver. It's now, with the customers coming along, you know, it's actually evolved. And I'll say, with our utility investments growing over time, we're now putting $5 billion a year into our utilities. So our utilities are investing in the kind of infrastructure that's going to allow this clean technology, resiliency, and this transition to a decarbonized economy happen. Because without the wires in the grid, a lot of this doesn't happen. So we've shifted our focus very aggressively to make sure we're investing in the right grid to meet the future needs of this economy.
That's an interesting point, Ken. The the transmission and distribution components of electricity is changing rapidly.
Right.
You know, the distribution of the generators, you know, whether it be a solar array or a wind, a group of wind generators, which incidentally are individually getting bigger and bigger in terms of their generating capacity. I guess you could say they're getting bigger wingspans.
A little higher, a little wider.
But that investment switch is kind of an interesting point, because we often hear, you know, oh my God, it's going to cost $9 trillion or something like this to solve the climate problem. But yet we're spending, you know, many hundreds of billions of dollars a year in the United States, maybe close to the T word, on infrastructure.
Yeah.
Particularly in the private sector. And so switching what we're spending the money on, you know, slowly but surely over a decade or two,
right,
you know, is something that I think we talk about in our report, the fact that we may not be really thinking that we have to have 9 trillion more. It may be, there may need to be more, but there may need to be a big switch in what we're already spending money on. I mean, and it sounds like you are in that mode now.
and not only in that way. When you think about let's talk about decarbonizing an economy. Your report highlights the big sectors that need to be electrified, and you know, economically electrified, transportation being a huge one. Obviously, building thermal load is another one. Industrial process. There's a lot of decarbonization on the demand side that has to happen if we are going to effectuate, you know, a zero-sum game by 2050. Think about what that does on the supply side. Right? What's the base load technology that's clean right now that's predominant in the industry? It's nuclear power. Right? 60% of all clean energy in this country is produced by nuclear power right now, right? And then think about shifting off of fossil fuels for thermal load in buildings, shifting off of fossil fuels for electric vehicles. I shifted years ago with driving electric vehicles, so hopefully I'm an early adopter.
You're using your product.
So shifting all that, you know, is going to counterbalance all the energy efficiency we still have to focus on in utility space, and then you have maybe an aging nuclear fleet. We can talk more about nuclear in a minute and some of the policies around nuclear, but shifting all that means there's a demand pressure that's going to cause a supply pressure, and so we have to keep investing in all technology areas to get to a solution that's both economic for our consumers and solves the problem. So, you know, we're investing in looking at new nuclear technology, small modular reactors, microgrids, things of that nature. We have a investment in what we call net power, which is burning natural gas in a different kind of cycle, mixing it with oxygen and producing energy, water, and pure CO2 that can be used in industrial process or put back into the ground. So actually looking at real sequestering of natural gas fire generation and taking the carbon out and making it, so we're invested there. We're spending a lot of time with national labs on battery technology. Battery technology obviously is going to be important with regard to storing intermittent renewable generation. So that needs to move along much more rapidly if we're going to achieve our goals. And so partnerships with government technology, business technology, trying to advance that. In electric vehicle space, we've already spent $125 million on many things, both in the competitive side and the utility side. We are, one of the big challenges with EV is adoption. Why, you know, consumers are afraid of range anxiety. Where do I plug my car in? So, you know, we have programs working with Maryland to do a pilot to build thousands of charging stations at workplaces, at homes, at public places. So, you know, pushing that agenda. I have innovative people in Constellation trying to figure out that adoption problem, and we have startup companies that actually are working their first territory here in DC to try to figure out how to get people interested in adopting electric vehicles by making the life easy. We're deploying or helping deploy with one of our electric bus investments, Proterra, deploying buses into different areas, cities or airports, and transitioning the diesel bus to an electric bus. It takes all these kinds of things and continued investment in energy efficiency at the utilities. We're also looking at, obviously, microgrids, smart systems for how we run our utilities, and we can't just do it where people can afford it. We have to do it, everywhere. We have to, and we have to do it in a way, like your report says, it doesn't impact low-income people. So we're focused in Chicago right now, in the Bronzeville territory, on tying microgrids to solar facilities and effectuating power supply for low-income housing projects. So these are the types of things that have to be done, and they really have to be done at all levels. So it's not just about what we've done. We have to advance the ball in all areas if we're going to get to this decarbonized economy.
So, you've identified, some of the drivers. You've identified some of the rationale behind the push and how you're incorporating that into your planning. And then we've now just started to drift a little into what are some of these technologies that are happening. Again, I'm still emphasizing a point I made before, that you're using your existing capital expenditures and adjusting how you're spending it.
That's right.
You have, but when we look at the policy front, let's move to that. I'm somebody that has been involved with pollution control for a lot of my career. And if I go back to the early days, it was Congress passing laws telling either me as a state environmental commissioner or as an official at EPA to put a regulation in place telling a business what to do. I mentioned selective catalytic reduction a little while ago.
You can explain that to everyone.
Yeah, it's a very efficient catalyst that reduces the nitrogen oxide emissions from a power plant, and it does it quite effectively. And nitrogen oxides are a precursor to ozone, as well as the deposition of it affects coastal estuaries in the Gulf of Mexico and other places. So now we have a situation where companies have these drivers, they have these desires, they're starting to change how they're spending money. What we're trying to point out is it's time to have policies that are going to help them do what they want to do as opposed to tell them what to do, which is a kind of an interesting switch on things. So thinking of the policies and thinking of what you just talked about, from the nascent world of advanced nuclear power to preserving the existing ones, to dealing with carbon capture from gas turbines, what kind of policies? We've identified a lot of policies. Somebody say, well, this is too complicated, too many policies. But the truth of the matter is there is no, as they say, silver bullet. If we just adopt this policy, all these things will happen. Maybe if we adopted some policies 30 years ago, that might be the case. But I think now, given our urgency and everything else, we need sector-based incentives and policies, as well as other national pricing type policies. But your perspective, what kind of policies would help you move faster on the things you're talking about?
So Exelon has long advocated for a carbon price, what you're advocating for in this strategic document. And we've heard enough conversation. We all know what the divide is at the federal government on that situation. And as that situation has kind of stagnated over time, what also has happened to the power markets are policies that essentially drive investment on the supply side toward renewables, policies that drive investment on a demand side toward energy efficiency, toward different demand response programs, different types of programs to control the demand side of the equation. And then you have these power markets that are also impacted heavily by natural gas prices being $2.50 an MMBTU instead of maybe $4 or $5.50 an MMBTU. And this gets to the policy that's near and dear to Exelon's heart, which is preserving the nuclear fleet. We are in a situation, and have been in a situation over several years, understanding what the nuclear fleet means to the success of any goal a state or our nation has on getting to a certain point with respect to carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. And our nuclear fleet has now lost 9 plants. We've lost 9 plants all over the country, some of it because of operations, some of it because of economics. And the problem's not getting solved at the federal level. So what Exelon has done at the state level is essentially work with states like Illinois, like New York, like New Jersey, to adapt their renewable goals to clean energy goals, and to provide a zero emissions credit to nuclear plants that otherwise would probably not exist. And we've been working on that and been successful on that. We've actually defended it in court against our competitors, all the way up to the highest courts in the world, in the land. And we continue to have this challenge. This challenge is effectuating itself on more plants than we originally solved the problem for maybe 3 or 4 years ago. So I've looked at a lot of models for decarbonizing, a lot of models for goals to get to a certain point within 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years. I spent a lot of time with EPRI on electrification as a board member of EPRI. And it is clear that nobody is coming up with a model that says, just let the nuclear plants go, we'll be fine. You let 1 or 2 nuclear plants go in a state, you have just pushed that state's carbon footprint back probably 1.5 decades to 2 decades of all the wind and solar investment that's happened. So it is urgent for Exelon, and it's at the top of my list, to make sure we do everything we can to try to maintain these nuclear plants, and that's the policy issue for my company. Obviously, what I just talked about in terms of more local strategies on microgrids, distributed energy, how you deal with the different income levels in your utility zones, especially in urban environments. How do you get there from all those perspectives? Very important. Investment in technology, and as technology advances, how do we maintain a policy pace that keeps up with that and allows everything to compete and considers everything, as opposed to just 1 or 2 or 3 technologies? That's our focus.
Yeah, you mentioned the alum process for gas turbines.
Yep.
You mentioned batteries. You mentioned charging stations.
Right.
All these things can be aided and abetted, as they say, by sound policy.
Yes.
And
absolutely.
All that mix is sort of like, can we get a price at some point? But then there are all these complementary policies, whether it's pushing the national labs or working with the public service commissions on how you guys invest in a utilities part of your business.
And one of the things we found, we invest in venture companies. We've also created a fund to seed venture technology within our urban areas to continue to get this message out and get the understanding out that we need to do more, and we need to do more at all levels. One of the things we find when we are dealing with companies that are really good on the technology side, they don't know how to deploy the technology properly on the grid and deal with the complexities of what that means and how the compensation model will work. So a lot of the work that we do in our Constellation marketing entity is to take those technologies and try to help those companies figure out the best way to deploy, whether it's you're deploying them in a purely competitive sense, or you're going to deploy them on the grid for utilities that have to convince their regulator in their state that this is worthwhile. So that's one of the not so subtle big challenges of all the technology development investment going on in technology space. Well, that needs to come with the experience of companies like Exelon that understand what it means to put that technology into the grid and how that would work potentially. A lot of work to be done there.
Well, you sort of,
That's a mouthful.
I mean, you've outlined, you know, the big picture, I think, for the power sector.
Yeah.
You know, where we have zero emitting resources now, whether it be hydro or nuclear, we need to hold. We need to go as fast as we can on renewables and some of the support technology in the grid and in the batteries and storage. And we need to figure out how to deal with emissions from the remaining carbon sources that are out there. So getting these policies right, this is my last question for you, which is probably an all-day conversation perhaps, but
You could probably answer it better
but
than I can based on what
but
work you've done.
this one really is, you know, and we heard the members of Congress say, you know, companies are going to be extremely helpful for them. You know, that's one of the messages in our work is, you know, getting that view into the policy mix in what we propose as good policy is a pretty important thing. So talk a little bit, you know, about how you see that evolving role in the corporate world and their influence. Now, transcending, you know, jump up beyond the power sector now in your role as a corporate lead, you know, a business leader in the country. You know, we have the Chamber of Commerce out there talking about climate change. You know, the business roundtables working on a climate policy. You know, these things. If I said those words 3 years ago, people would. This largest crowd, other than the other one, would laugh.
Right.
So, but these things are really happening.
They're evolving quickly.
And so, how do you see that role helping the two guys that were here earlier and their other 500 and something colleagues?
I do feel like there's positive momentum from industry, from the environmental community, and I think that's starting to come together. We were forced into that situation with our nuclear challenges for years now, and we started to form partnerships, interesting partnerships that you wouldn't 5 or 6 or 7 years ago think could exist. How do we get clean? You know, if our goal is to decarbonize, and we all, as industries and as the environmental community, believe that that is the end game, then everything about the modeling I talked about and the numbers and the math say there isn't one solution. Right? We need more renewable power. We do need to maintain this nuclear fleet. We need to evolve technology so that we can grow both or supplant both with something that makes sense. In the meantime, we can't go backwards. So you're seeing that kind of coalescing because there's all of a sudden a goal that's bigger than a technology or an industry. And now that we have that, we have to take advantage of it. You know, the Climate Leadership Council is made up of, we joined it a year ago, it's made up of a lot of big companies from across a lot of the biggest industries and service industries in the United States. And that organization, including environmental members, is coalescing around a carbon fee and a dividend. Now, that wouldn't have happened, like you said, 3 years ago. So if we're going to help those guys, you know, that's what we have to come to. And then when you come with that voice and that diverse of a voice and that diverse of a technology spectrum, I think we would have a better chance of effectuating policy as business and climate leaders.
Well, Ken, I'm going to thank you for spending some time with us today. Thank you for the work you're doing. Obviously, there's a lot to do. Almost everything we talked about has 20 different sides to it.
Yeah, right.
But I really appreciate the work you're doing. I appreciate you taking the time to come and talk about how that transcends your own company to the broader view of how businesses are evolving, and in particular the point about the customers, who are also the voters. So hopefully that can convert as we come forward. So thank you so much.
Bob. Yep.
I'm going to end my part of the program here. I guess I got double things. And I want to thank the Congressman again and Ken for his participation. And I want to now, I'm inviting up you or Brad. All right, so I'm going to invite Elliot Derringer, our Executive Vice President, up. But before Elliot comes up, I want to do an audible at the line here, as they say in football. It is football season. I want all the C2ES employees to raise your hand who are here. The work that we're talking about today, everybody at C2ES worked on. We all have a lot of different jobs at C2ES. We're a relatively small group, but everybody worked on it. I also have several board members here who have been supporting us. Trammell Crow in the back. Leslie Carruthers here. And I didn't see if any others came in, but I want to appreciate, and I continue to appreciate, the support of our board of directors. So with that, Elliot, I'm going to turn it over to you to go through some more details on the report.
Thanks, Bob. I'd like to add my thanks to Ken Cornew for joining us this morning to give us a CEO's perspective. Also want to thank the many other companies that have worked so closely with us over the past year to develop the agenda that we're presenting to you this morning. As you can see from the list in the report, these companies come from quite a few different sectors: power, transportation, oil and gas, mining, chemicals, cement, manufacturing, food and agriculture, and a couple of others. Indeed, we think that the very multi-sectoral nature of this initiative is one of its real strengths. As Bob noted, the companies that contributed to the agenda and are listed in the report don't necessarily subscribe to each and every one of its recommendations, but I think that publicly associating themselves with this agenda, by doing that, they are very clearly signaling their support for its overall thrust. And some of them have been coming up to the Hill with us to brief key committees on the recommendations that it contains. Bob referred earlier to the many signs we see of growing momentum for climate action, and I think the fact that so many leading companies have engaged so closely with us in developing and advancing this agenda is another very visible sign of that growing momentum. I'm going to hand the podium over to Brad Townsend in a moment to give you an overview of the agenda. But first, I'd just like to join Bob in acknowledging the team at C2ES that has helped put it all together. One of the key messages highlighted in the report is that decarbonization must be an all-in effort. Turns out that was true of this agenda as well. Virtually the entire C2EF staff has had some hand in constructing and presenting it. So I'd like to thank each and every one of them for all the hard work that's gone into that. And with that, I will turn things over to Brad to walk you through the highlights.
Thanks, Elliot. Good morning, everybody. I guess I should start by echoing the thank you to the rest of the C2ES staff and team. I don't want to be the only one who doesn't do that. And so let me just, again, reiterate how important it was to have everybody across the organization really with their sleeves rolled up working on this. Thank you all also for being here this morning. We are excited to release Getting to Zero, a U.S. climate agenda. In addition to the full-length reports that you have on your chairs, we've also produced an abridged, interactive digital version of the agenda, which I'll use to walk you through the overview this morning. As Bob mentioned earlier, our aim with this report was to identify policies over the next 10 years that we need to put in place in order to put the U.S. on a path to reaching carbon neutrality by 2050. So, the table of contents here sort of gives you a quick overview of the report. We start by introducing the decarbonization challenge and articulating the objectives that frame this agenda. We then outline some core policy elements, including recommendations addressing carbon pricing, finance, innovation, and ensuring a just transition. Next, we outline policies addressing each of the key economic sectors: power, transportation, industry, buildings, land use, and oil and gas. We also recommend policies to advance key technologies that can help across a range of different economic sectors. And finally, we recommend steps that companies should take on their own. Throughout the report, we outline a very diverse mix of policies. These policies are meant to work in concert, and the nature and mix of federal, state, and local policy varies by sector. And the timing, strength, and scale of some policies will be dependent upon the timing, strength and scale of other policies, such as carbon pricing, for example. The timing and details there obviously matter quite a bit. In terms of defining the decarbonization challenge, we underscored the clear scientific imperative for reaching carbon neutrality by 2050. We identify, from a physical standpoint, the key elements of that transition, such as increasing efficiency, electrification, and enhancing sequestration. We note that while innovation is critical, it's not enough. We need policy to help bring these technologies into the market. We emphasize also, as Elliot noted, that decarbonization is going to be an all-in effort. There are no free lunches. Everyone will have to play their part. We note some important temporal dimensions that doesn't just speak to the urgency of the issue, but also the need to be mindful of things like capital cycles in terms of trying to enhance the cost effectiveness of any strategy. Finally, we underscore some important co-benefits of climate action, including economic growth, enhanced competitiveness, and national security. We lay out a number of strategic initiatives that help to inform the agenda, a few of which include achieving net zero by 2050, no later than 2050, strengthening U.S. Global leadership, taking a technology-inclusive approach, including with nuclear carbon capture and sequestration, protecting and enhancing U.S. competitiveness and energy security, ensuring an equitable transition, and providing certainty to help drive long-term investment. When it comes to the recommendations themselves, there are a few too many to walk you through all of those this morning, but I'm going to just highlight a few of those that we think are most critical in the agenda. And so, as we noted, there are 4 core elements to the agenda. The establishment of a long-term policy framework, driving innovation, mobilizing finance, and ensuring a just transition. In the long-term framework, we recommend that Congress establish a national goal of making the U.S. carbon neutral no later than 2050 and establish a new overarching statutory framework to allow that to happen. As part of that, Congress should vest the president with statutory responsibility to direct efforts across the federal government to achieve this goal. And also to review that progress every 4 years, which can help inform the U.S.'s nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. In terms of economy-wide pricing, rather than recommend a particular approach, we identify 3 different options: cap and trade, carbon tax, and also tradable performance standards. C2ES actually has a report coming on this very soon that I would encourage all of you to look at that will provide some more details on that particular approach. We also outline some principles that any approach should adhere to, including safeguarding competitiveness, allowing for the continuation of equivalent state-level programs, and also establishing backstop regulatory authority in the event that targets are not met. In innovation, we recommend that the White House-led strategy include a low-carbon innovation agenda that can help to drive and coordinate efforts across the U.S. government. To fund that effort, we recommend that Congress ramp up funding for climate-related research and development to $20 billion a year by 2030. That number includes $2 billion a year for ARPA-E. Additionally, we recommend an additional $50 to $100 billion over the next decade be invested in high-impact demonstration projects. We also recommend steps to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of federal R&D efforts, including to better partner with the private sector in those efforts. We recommend a set of innovation priorities. These are key research areas that research should focus on. In finance, to help shift investment toward low-carbon solutions, we recommend that Congress direct the Security and the SEC to require public companies to disclose material climate-related financial risks. We also recommend that the Federal Reserve integrate consideration of climate-related risks into the periodic stress testing already required of major financial institutions. And to better leverage private finance, we recommend the creation of a national green bank. To help ensure a just transition, we recommend that climate policies include mechanisms to minimize any cost burden on low-income households. We also recommend that Congress support the development of new industries in regions that have been economically dependent on high-carbon industries. Again, the agenda recommends specific policies for each of the key sectors: power, transportation, industry, buildings, land use, and oil and gas. In the power sector, we think that robust carbon pricing should really be the principal policy driver here. But we also recommend tax credits for a range of zero-carbon generation sources, including offshore wind and nuclear. We recommend steps that Congress and FERC can take to plan and develop climate-critical infrastructure. We also recommend that Congress set a date certain when all remaining fossil-fired generation either use carbon capture or be fully offset through sequestration. In transportation, the top recommendation here is the creation of a strong federal greenhouse gas performance standard that ensures half of new light-duty vehicle sales are zero-emission vehicles by 2035. To ensure that the necessary charging and refueling infrastructure is in place, we recommend that Congress provide funding to states to develop and implement comprehensive infrastructure plans. We also recommend that state and local governments provide a broader array of low and zero carbon mobility options. And we also recommend steps to reduce emissions from freight, aviation, and the maritime sector. In industry, this is obviously a particularly challenging sector given the inherent nature of many industrial processes and the very large quantities of thermal energy that they require. So we recommend increased R&D funding that will be absolutely critical to develop alternative manufacturing processes and advanced renewable thermal technologies. We recommend incentives for fuel switching and for the use of carbon capture and other low-carbon solutions. We also recommend ratifying the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol to help phase down the use of hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs. And lastly, we recommend steps to safeguard industrial competitiveness and to avoid carbon leakage and undermine those emissions reductions. In buildings, state and local action is really going to be critical in this sector. And so we recommend that state and local governments set overarching goals for decarbonizing both residential and commercial buildings, and that they regularly update building codes to take advantage of the latest and most available cost-effective technologies available. We also recommend federal, state, and local incentives for building owners to increase energy efficiency and to switch to electricity for space and water heating. We also recommend measures to help finance building upgrades. There are really two overarching objectives in the land use sector. The first is to reduce agricultural emissions, and the second to increase carbon sequestration on farms and in forests. This enhanced sequestration is critical to achieving carbon neutrality, as we expect that many sectors, including the industrial sector, will still be producing some emissions by 2050. We recommend incentives for farmers to use growing practices that would increase carbon storage in agricultural soils, for instance, allowing them to be used as offsets in any economy-wide pricing program. We recommend steps to reduce food waste and develop lower carbon foods. And finally, we recommend increased federal funding to help restore forests and reduce the risk of wildfire. In oil and gas, many of the recommendations we've already outlined elsewhere in the report help to reduce demand for fossil fuels, but this chapter really recommends additional steps to reduce the footprint of the oil and gas sector itself. The first recommendation I'd highlight here is the adoption of stringent federal standards to reduce methane emissions throughout the oil and gas value chains, including emissions from natural gas flaring, venting, and other unintentional leaks. We also recommend steps to promote the production and use of renewable natural gas. And we lastly recommend amending the tax code to phase federal subsidies away from higher carbon resources and toward lower carbon energy sources. As we noted, there are a number of cross-sectoral elements here. We don't have time to walk through all of those, but the agenda recommends specific recommendations for 4 different sets of technology that have potential across multiple sectors to aid in decarbonization efforts. For example, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. This includes direct air capture, which, like natural forms of sequestration, will be critical to help offset remaining emissions in 2050. I'd also call your attention to our recent report outlining strategies to advance the utilization of captured carbon. I think my colleague Jeff Bobeck is here somewhere. Jeff, if you raise your hand, would also be an excellent resource for folks on that report. The other three areas in this sector include, or in this section of the agenda, rather, include digitalization, bioenergy, and hydrogen. Our final chapter recommends steps that companies should take on their own to manage their emissions, invest in long-term climate solutions, boost their resilience to climate risks, disclose climate-related risks, and partner with others, especially working with policymakers to support policies that can help advance the decarbonization effort. So again, these are all steps that we're recommending be taken over the next decade. As Bob noted earlier, this is less of a definitive blueprint than our best cut at the moment, and with the input of companies who are going to be tasked with carrying out the decarbonization effort. And so I'm sure many of you have questions. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to ask you to hold those so that we can bring up our panel. But please stay tuned. We are thinking about a webinar to help provide an additional deeper dive and answer some questions. In the meantime, I'd encourage you to take a closer look, and we look forward to working with all of you to keep this conversation going. Thank you.